Hi, this is Sheb Varghese. Welcome to the Faith Colloquium podcast. Today, my guest is Wade Ortego. Wade earned his graduate degree from Abilene Christian University in education.
Yes.
And today we're talking about classical Christian education. Wade, thanks for talking with me.
Thanks for having me.
So the first question I wanted to ask you, you're the headmaster of a classical Christian school. You've been in classical education for a while. What is classical Christian education?
Yeah, that is the constant question, right? What is this thing that we're doing with these students? So classical ed, it breaks into a couple of different areas. For the majority of us, we would say it's based in the Trivium. We'd start pulling the Quadrivium in at different pieces for sure. But this idea of an education based on an ancient model, right? The recovery of it through the medieval times, we would definitely lean into that at some point. But this idea of a grammar school, a logic school, and a rhetoric school, pulling students through history, right? Tying them to what our forefathers knew. The idea of inculcating education, right? Growing them into a place of learning, to be constant learners, to be seeking truth, goodness and beauty. You will hear that quite often amongst us. Really this idea of pushing students to where the place God has taken them. He's formed them and shaped them, and we want to give them the skills. And we think classical ed, that model really does that for students. This idea of pushing students beyond what contemporary education says they're capable of. And we would include responsibilities as well. We feel modern education has kind of held them back on what they could do, and we know this just by looking at the historical record of education. So students are much more capable than what modern education calls forth from them. So we want to push that. At the same time, we want to balance it with a lot of love and a lot of hope, so that it doesn't push them into education only kind of places.
How would you say that's different from just like a Christian, like your typical sort of Christian school?
Yeah, there's a couple of talking points on that for sure. So the idea of integrating subject matter. So we would separate ourselves out, saying we don't want to just a Bible on the side. The best way I've heard, the best analogy that I heard was this meatloaf, right? This idea of like you get a hamburger and you get ketchup on it. We don't want a hamburger with ketchup. We actually want meatloaf. So we want the ketchup all throughout the meatloaf, right? And that ketchup for us would be scripture, Bible, biblical truth. Okay. That completely integrated into every subject matter, not just a helping on the side. That's probably the best analogy that I've heard.
Sure. So if we were to caricature or make generalizations, like in a lot of maybe Christian school models, you get a range of subjects. Yeah. And those subjects are pretty much taught in the same way that a secular school would teach those subjects, more or less. Yeah. But the difference is they might have a Bible class, or they might have a chapel or something like that. Right. And so this is what makes them a Christian school.
Yeah, we would say that Bible class is it's not a subject, right? It is the subject. Okay. Pulling back from some classical ed pieces, right? We would say theology is the queen of the sciences. So you can't do anything without that piece. We think truth resides with Christ, and therefore it has to be integrated into all things. We don't see a separation of subjects. We want them completely integrated. We don't want it compartmentalized. We don't believe God made the world that way. Right? He made it all. It's all His. Therefore, we want to teach it all, and we want to integrate those pieces into it. So that's probably one of the biggest differences you'll see.
I think there's a reputation among classical Christian schools that this creates maybe a certain kind of elitism maybe among a student culture. So students at classical schools are studying logic, they're studying Latin, studying Greek sometimes. So there's already this high academic standard, and then you're learning all these subjects that aren't typical. So to what extent do you think that stereotype is real, and if it is real to some extent, like what do you think classical Christian schools can do to kind of mitigate some of those problems?
Yeah, this is a good point, and I'm not sure the classical education movement, 30 plus years old at this point, has ever really engaged this well, right? We talk about liberal arts, right? So liberal meaning an education for free, right? So it was the idea that people with free time, right, had the ability to go and educate themselves in these areas. Modern mechanization, moved us in that direction to where we have a lot more free time. I think there's also, what do we do with our children now that we don't have them working? So we sent them off to schools. Right?
Yeah.
That was a lot of this idea. The question about elitism is one that we haven't handled well because we are elite. I mean, we don't want to say it because we have it categorized in these certain subjects, in certain areas, to where we're not comfortable with the language. But the reality is people are paying for this education.
Yeah.
It's a private education.
Yeah.
There are groups, charter schools and different things like that are trying to bring classical components to it, to engage that. But the reality is people are taking resources that they don't have to spend on education and putting them towards it. That creates a certain amount of elitism in itself. Now, when we're talking about like social pieces of it, attitude pieces, culture pieces of it, that's sin.
Yeah.
Right? To view yourself better than those around you is counter-biblical.
Yeah.
So that should be addressed. But the reality is it's an education that people are paying for, and that is a divider. The same way when we talk about education, it's a financial divider. When you get into higher ed, I think we should just deal with it straight on and say what it is. That's true. So what can we do as classical schools? I think we can have robust tuition programs. We can be fiscally conservative with our resources, good stewards of what God gives us, so that we can create scholarship programs for students who otherwise couldn't afford it but are fit. I think that's an area that we have not worked really hard in as an association. Another area that I've seen really good growth in this is where churches have created scholarship funds to help their parishioners send their children to Christian schools. So there's a lot of ways we could talk about that elitism piece when it comes to finances that I think we haven't.
So that's just kind of like making it available to folks who, like, otherwise they wouldn't be able to seriously consider it for financial reasons.
Yeah. There's a lot. I mean, and when you look across the country, there's a lot of different schools at different price points.
Yeah.
So that's a part of it. So we're not talking about some of the schools that are $25,000 a year, right? They have scholarship programs. Most of them do. It's our smaller schools that have had a hard time creating scholarship programs. So.
Okay. And do you think teachers have a responsibility in the classroom as well, like to also model, exemplify certain virtues?
Oh, most definitely. Before I answer that, how many teachers do you have listening to this podcast? No, I think that is where the rubber hits the road.
Yeah.
Right? What happens in the classroom is chief among what we do. It has to have a big priority. When we talk about enculturation, we talk about paideia, we would say, the Bible tells us, right, that the student will be like their teacher. So what their teacher is doing and how they're living is replicated in those students. It's very important who's in front of your children. We would say, look, anybody can put a worksheet on the table. It's why, how, what comes with it.
Right.
The work still has to be done. We want to pull from the best of the works. That's a classical piece of it, right? Great books. The ideas of Latin and Greek, like we're pulling the best pieces, but what's most important is who's putting those pieces in front of students.
Yeah, that's helpful. So a lot of classical Christian schools are heavily influenced by the Reformed tradition, and the classical school that I went to when I was in junior high also even tried to, like, we memorized the shorter Westminster Catechism. And so there's that strong Reformed piece that they also want to pass on to students. I know that, if I remember correctly, you didn't grow up Reformed.
I didn't.
No. And you've kind of come from I'm
a mutt.
Yeah, a variety of theological traditions. So I'm just curious to hear you talk a little bit about how that's shaped how you approach leading a classical school, how you bring your background into thinking about families and teachers and all that.
Yeah, so I'm very firm on the idea within the classical school that we are not as important as the church or the family. I would say there's only two institutions that God ordained, the church and the family.
Okay.
We are an unfortunate byproduct. My wholehearted desire would be that churches would fund and run schools. That's what I would love to see done. It just hasn't made that much headway. Catholics have been able to do really, really well with it. The Catholic Church has done extremely well with that model. Protestant folks, we just can't ever get our act together. The Lutherans did a really good job of hanging on to a lot of the pieces that we still have. But when you look at a whole, you just don't see that many systems around. And often when those systems, and it's their prerogative, right? Their prerogative, they start them, they run them, they kind of turn inward on each other, or on themselves, and they forget about the people around. I think that's what's important about the Association for Classical Schools, the Society of Classical Learning. These groups keep us from turning inward on ourselves. And I think the diversity within that helps us. There's no way that you can't bring some of that into what you're doing, because we're talking about theology, we're talking about scripture. Those pieces always have presuppositions tied to them, right? This is the great secret of neutral education. There is none.
Right. You can't pretend like you don't have presuppositions.
That's right. Yeah. People will say, "Hey, it's just a textbook. Do whatever you want with it." Listen, whoever picks it up is going to do something with it.
Yeah.
And that person has motives, and they don't. I'm not saying they're nefarious. Good motives too, but they're still motives.
Right.
Let's don't be disingenuous about that.
Right.
So I think everyone brings that to the table. I think we should. I think that's part of working out our salvation in fear and trembling. Like we're sharing that with the people that we engage with.
Yeah.
Our communities God places us with.
Yeah.
I think often our idea of community of who God places us with is way too small. So, and that's definitely some of my background, and my God's been very gracious to me and my family, and we've seen a wide spectrum of faith, and it's been great for us. We reside in the Reformed Church. It took me a long time to get there, and I want to be gracious with that grace that got me there.
Yeah.
But also humble enough to know that I can keep on learning. And I think we're afraid of language like that because we're afraid people will say, "Oh, well, then you'll be progressive," and there's nothing worse than being in a classical environment and you've been labeled a progressive. Right. You just can't do it.
Yeah.
So I think you want to keep a balance on it. I think you want to realize that we're the least important piece. We're a school who has a job to do, but that job is to partner with families, and that family's job is to partner with a congregation, and that we should be reinforcing those things.
Yeah.
That's the balancing act that I think a good teacher has to be able to do, to realize the family is what's important. How do I not undermine this? And we operate off statements of faith, right? We have primary and secondary doctrine. I'm very much married to those documents and think we should follow them and respect them. I don't want to see us getting in between a family or the church that God's placed them in.
Yeah.
And I think you can make those statements and you can evaluate those and say, hey, does this family really fit our culture? So I think you find more Reform-leaning schools. You find more Baptist-leaning schools, Lutherans, right? There's several organizations that are still doing great work in the classical movement, and they're going to vary on a couple of different items, but most of us can agree on the big doctrine pieces.
Yeah.
So let's try to do that.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of the current revision that we're experiencing right now, right? This flood of classical schools. I think you have to look at repairing the ruins. You have to look at those writings, and you have to say, okay, this thing leans Reform because the guys who really pushed it back to the forefront were Reformed guys. Yeah. So a lot of the material you're getting, but we're seeing a diversification of that now. There's a ton of publishers out now. Right. Previously, people had to make their own stuff, or you were using things that were made by some of the early pioneers who were Reformed guys. Yeah. I think the benefit of being in a classical environment, right, in a Christian environment, is being able to weigh these things. We teach our kids to do it every day in class, right? Take this thing out, weigh this thing. What's the piece that you can use? What's the piece that you really don't need? And push forward. But ultimately, as a school, that's not our decision. It's a family and a church decision. So
that's helpful. So that is kind of getting back to the piece you mentioned earlier about some schools want to play the role of church, and you would want to push back against that.
Yeah, I mean, I think if a church runs a school, great, wonderful. I think that would be wonderful. I would love to see it. And there are some great ones doing it. And I think we got a lot to learn from them. But the majority of our schools are independent institutions. And as independent institutions, we need to respect the role of the family in the church. And that's knowing where God's placed you and how he's framed you as an institution. That's really important. We want to be clear in our dealings with those people around us. So I think the church schools that have been able to support themselves and fund themselves and pull from their congregations, that's amazing. I think you see a lot of this in like some homeschool co-ops more than you see it in, full-on schools. But several have been able to do it. The majority of us are still independent institutions, and we are beholden to parents and church. So
the other thing that strikes me is that a typical classical Christian student going through their education is going to be reading Thomas Aquinas or Dante or Martin Luther or C.S. Lewis or lots of thinkers or Plato or Aristotle who were not Reformed or not Christian or not Christian, right? And so it seems like the humility of being able to learn from thinkers outside of our own tradition, many of whom we've been the recipients of, right, is helpful.
Yeah, I think being able to rest in the idea that all truth is God's truth, right? That's a very comforting place when you're reading these people. I never envisioned a place to where I would be the guy running a Christian school defending the pagan authors, right? But that is the conversation that I have more than not. I mean, wonderful Christian family comes in, they love Jesus, and they just help us understand why our kid is reading this. And you're like, okay, let's have this conversation. And sometimes it's conversations that it doesn't matter what you say or how you try to explain it, families really have a hard time with it. But it is this idea of being able to pull from these things that have created a foundation for what we know culturally. And these ideas of knowing what the monsters are and understanding that there are nights to save them and that we have one, right? This idea of this one epic story that we're fortunate to be a part of. The rest of the world is constantly trying to make your own story, and we're trying to tell kids, no, find your place in God's story, right? And that is offensive when you say find your place, right? But it's the truth for us, right? The idea that we are we're just happy to be a part of the story. We're glad to be a part of what he's doing in Christendom.
We're part of this great long tradition.
It's the greatest story ever told, right? I mean, this idea of the greatest story ever told, everything is replicating of trying to either get us back to him, show us why we need him, or try to rebel against him. So there's useful things in everything we pick up. There's also knowing right from wrong, and those things have been known for a long time outside of what we would consider Christian canon. And the pagans make it really, really obvious for us.
And so we can be glad for their work and their thinking and helping us.
I think we can be grateful. Right? I mean, we're grateful that God redeems these things for our benefit.
Was there anything else, Wade, you wanted to mention about classical Christian education that we haven't touched on?
I love it. I consider myself a zealot to it. I mean, I have a hard time having conversations outside of these circles anymore. And that's unfortunate. It's something I need to work on. I have really good friends who went to college with that are actively in public education. And I want to support those guys. At the same time, I don't think I would ever do it. It's something that you see it change students and families constantly. There's no way this thing goes into a person and doesn't start altering the way they view God's design and how he puts things together. So I just love it. And if more people want to do it, it's great.
It's great.
Yeah.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please subscribe. Please share with your friends.